Hello and welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling Seminar Series. I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm a professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and I'm the director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the Brain and Mind Centre. I am really pleased to be bringing us this excellent episode, which is one of my favourites, if not my favourite, of the season, which I can say before we even started. This is our Early Career Researchers Showcase. Now, one of the reasons that Professor Khalil Philander and I originally started the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series was during COVID. We were really upset about the idea that there were no conferences going on, because that was the way that we got our foot in the field of going to conferences, meeting people, showcasing our research, even if it was a poster or a small presentation lost in the sessions. But it was a really important opportunity. And so what we wanted to do was bring a platform through which early career researchers can be showcased and highlighted to the broad field. And this is a tradition that we've kept on for today. So I'm really delighted that Khalil has jumped back on board for his cameo of the season to be involved in the ECR showcase. I am going to start introducing three different ECR fellows, and Khalil will introduce three more. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert Heirene, who is at the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, Brain and Mind Centre. Rob, would you like to turn it over to you to introduce yourself and share your research with us?
Hi, Sally. Thanks very much for that introduction. As mentioned, my name's Rob Heirene. I'm a research fellow who works closely with Sally at the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic. And today I'm going to talk about a study that I've skipped far ahead on already. I'm showing you too much. A study that we started earlier this year that involved collecting what we think is quite a unique and exciting data set related to online gambling. So we worked with an online gambling company that runs two online wagering sites in Australia. We invited around 25,000 of their customers to take part in a survey about their gambling, asking them a variety of questions about things like their problem gambling status, their experience of gambling-related harms, their level of self-control, their understanding of their gambling and how much they think they've gambled recently and they're going to gamble in the future, as well as various other things like demographic factors. And then we were able to collect the behavioral account data from these wagering sites for these individuals, including all of their bets, their transactions, and their engagement with the site. But what was really great is that we were able to get that account data for all of the roughly 25,000 people that were invited, regardless of whether they actually chose to take part in the survey or not. The flowchart here sort of outlines this process of recruitment in more detail, but I have a very limited time, so I'll just leave that there for people who want to pause and take a look. So we're hoping to do lots of exciting things with this data set, but today I just wanted to talk about the very first two things that we've been doing, starting with trying to answer this question here. So as we were collecting the data, we realized that we had this really unique opportunity to find out how similar the people who chose to take part in the survey were to those who didn't choose to do it, and they opted out. There were about 2,000 people who started the survey, so we could sort of compare those two groups and look for any evidence of selection bias or non-response bias in this case. And we did that in a number of ways, starting with just some simple pairwise comparisons between the two groups on key demographic and wagering characteristics, including age, gender, how much somebody's gambling, how regularly, how much they're losing, and so on. And we found that between those two groups, most of the differences were rather negligible. But the people who responded to the survey were typically older. They'd gambled more recently leading up to the survey, and they gambled more regularly as well. Next, we then tried to create a single score that represented people's past 6-month gambling behavior, with sort of larger scores representing more highly involved and potentially risky behavior. So it summed their variability in gambling, the amount they were spending, how much they were losing, and so on, in a way that gave everyone a score that was relative to the remainder of the people in the data set. And what we found was a very clear relationship with the most involved quartile of those people based on that score were most likely to complete our survey, around 14%, with decreasing proportions then with each quartile going down, with only about 4% in the bottom quartile taking part. We then finally tried to use some statistical modeling to see if we could try and identify or predict who would be most likely to take part in the survey. We used some a Bayesian simulation technique to try and winnow down the 37 variables to a selection of consistently useful variables in terms of improving model performance. And then we performed a logistic regression, the outcomes of which are shown here in this diagram on the right. And interestingly, the variables that were most predictive of taking part of the survey were having more options available for withdrawing money from someone's account and depositing money. So whether that's PayPal or bank transfer or credit card and so on. But overall, the model wasn't particularly useful at differentiating between these groups. It only accounted for about 8% of the variance in the outcome, despite extensive attempts to try and improve model performance. But we think this is a good thing because it suggests that really it's difficult to differentiate between these two groups based on their gambling behavior. The next thing we did is look at people's use of and the impact of activity statements. So as of July 2022, all gambling sites in Australia are required to send their customers a monthly activity statement that summarizes their past month gambling. So how much they've won, how much they've lost, how much money they've deposited into their account and so on. But there's been no real evaluation of this policy. So we first asked people just simply, are they reading the statements that they're sent? Because they're sent via email to customers and they can opt to read them or not. We found that about 57% of people said that they're reading them at least sometimes. Then we asked people whether their behavior they think has changed in response to reading these statements. And what we found was that about 80% of people, which is represented in this gray color here, said that there'd been no change in their behavior. Very, very few, so 0.1% suggested they had increased their behavior as a result of seeing statements. And about 17% in total said that they decreased their behavior. There's this very clear monotonic rise with risk level as determined by the PGSI and saying that the statements had led to decrease in their gambling, which we think is positive. But interesting because being a high-risk gambler, according to PGSI status, was most likely associated with not reading the statements. So they're least likely to read them, but most likely to benefit from them. And finally, then we looked at the account data and we looked at different variables, including the number of bets people were placing each day and how much they were depositing, sort of plotted trends in those variables over time around the dates that statements were sent to people towards the end of 2023. So these black dotted lines here are statement dates. We tried to see, if, first of all, if there's just any observable change in behavior following those dates. And clearly from these graphs, you can see that there's a clear weekly pattern, which is illustrated by these gray bars here, which represent weekend days. And we performed some statistical modeling here, which is represented in this lower panel here using interrupted time series analysis via segmented regression modeling to try and confirm again whether there is any statistical change in behavior around these statement dates. And again, that confirmed that there was no meaningful effect. And the only signal in the data really were these weekend days, this blue line here, which represents a major sporting race event in Australia, and this middle bump here in the middle of the week, which we think may represent paydays, common paydays in Australia, but it's a working theory at the moment. So overall, we thought these results have seemed relatively positive in terms of the impact of activity statements. There's no clear change in behavior around the statement dates, but what's positive is that there's no clear increase, at least, in expenditure or gambling, because there was some concern that when people see their losses, perhaps in these statements, they might start chasing them. So that's it for me. It's a very rapid summary of the first two studies, but we've got lots more planned.
That's awesome. Thanks very much, Rob. Now, I've got a couple of questions to delve a little bit deeper. And anyone who's watching live can feel free to pop some questions in the chat, and Rob can answer them in the chat as well. And you can also contact Rob on these details below. So I'm interested if you can explain, because we have an increasing number of studies and groups around the world who are looking at behavioural data. Often this is anonymous behavioural data, so we have access to account data de-identified, but we don't have the surveys. There's only been a few groups that have been able to get access. Now, there's some contention around this because it does require cooperation with industry. And so it's not that anyone can just go and do these sorts of studies, but what are the advantages? Can you talk me through briefly the limitations of working, with only the account data that can be overcome, and what's unique about having the matched survey responses in terms of our understanding?
Yeah, thanks for that, Sally. That's a great question. So you're right. There's been an increase in recent years in people being able to access account data, and I agree that that should be more widely available for everyone. But this type of research where we match the survey responses does require some cooperation and engagement with industry. But there are huge benefits to this that far beyond what we can get from account data alone. So a lot of what people try to do with the account data, for example, and something we're trying to do is they try and look at can you identify who is and isn't sort of playing a risky level and who is therefore likely to experience gambling harm. But we know pretty consistently that there's no sort of clear linear relationship between any single variable and gambling harm. So it's difficult to do that. But the variables then that people are using as their outcome are often things like self-exclusion, which we know is incredibly rare in these data sets, and might also not perfectly represent what we're trying to find out, which is somebody experiencing harm. So somebody might not self-exclude until they've reached the point of quite severe harms, or the site has stepped in and asked them to self-exclude. Um, so we're not capturing in that data then the people who are experiencing harm but haven't self-excluded, which is probably a large proportion of those individuals. So this really allows us to start to see, can we pick up people at an earlier level who are telling us that they're experiencing problems, telling us that they're experiencing harm. And then another thing that we can do with this, which we're hoping to do, is see, okay, how much can we improve the prediction of these machine learning models by including some of these other variables that we've asked people. So if we ask people about things like their income level, for example, how much can we improve the prediction and the identification of at-risk customers through having a better understanding of their income level, for example, and how much they're spending relative to that. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Excellent. And I understand, and it's great you've acknowledged Entain Australia. I understand this is also funded by the International Centre of Responsible Gambling through a
Right.
Centre of Excellence funding. So this funding is about enhancing people's use of responsible gambling tools. So can you tell me what's next? And this is a question all of our early career researchers are going to be asking. What are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, lots of different things, too much. So as I just mentioned, we're looking at risk prediction. Can we improve the way that the researchers and these online sites identify at-risk consumers and therefore can intervene at an earlier level? We're also looking at replicating some work that we did earlier at people's understanding of their recent gambling. So can they accurately estimate how much they have won or lost over the last 30 days, for example, and then extending that to going forward? Do people have an accurate understanding of how much they can spend, how much they're going to win, and what are the correlates of that variable? How useful is that in terms of understanding who is and isn't at risk of gambling-related harm? We're also looking at using this data to further look at the low risk guidelines, which have been first established in Canada, but also in Australia. But so far, these guidelines have been mostly based on self-report data, which the earlier research that I talked about shows it typically is not very reliable in terms of estimating people's spend and their gambling involvement. People most often underestimate how much they're spending, how much they're losing, and how often they're gambling. So we can use this objective account data to try and better estimate what are low levels of risky gambling. And because we've got these PGSI scores and gambling harm scores, we can look to validate those against different measures of harm.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Rob. Now I'm going to move to our next early career researcher. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Sally.
So I'm very pleased to introduce Sunny Nong. Sunny, I have known since you worked in my lab as a research intern several years ago. So it's terrific to have you as part of our ECR showcase. You're currently doing your PhD, and I'll hand it over to you to share your slides and introduce yourself.
Okay. Hello everyone. I am Sunny Nong, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Macau studying hospitality management. And today, I would like to share with you a research project we conducted at University of Macau, looking at how casino ambient scents affect individuals' attention on gambling outcomes and also the implications we learned for responsible gambling. First, I would like to thank my supervisor, Professor Lawrence Fong, and my co-supervisor, Professor Annie Wu and Professor David Fong for their contribution to this project. So, um, many casinos refuse the, is it moving to the second slide? Okay, now it's working. Many casinos diffuse a pleasant ambient scent into their facilities as the casino experience enhancement. But the ethics of this scenting process is questionable. Although the effect of a pleasant scent on cognitive, emotional, and behavior response has been well documented, the influence of attention during gambling has yet to be explored. Grounded in the tenet of the top-down attention and cross-modal correspondence between the vision and affection, we conducted two eye-tracking experiments. So we select two casino games, live table games of Crusade, also called Sigbo, and the video slots to enhance the external validity. The game ran on a computer equipped with eye-tracking device called BTX300. You can see the parameter of the eye tracker at the bottom of this slide. The aroma oil we used in the experiment was provided by a casino in Macau. So with these setting and material, this study examining if the player in a room with a pleasant ambient scent pay more attention to the win-loss area on their screen. So the results were as expected. In scented condition, more attention is given to the rears of the video slots and to the win-loss outcome in the live crusade as marked by the yellow rectangle on both figures in the form of longer fixation and visit duration, as well as more fixation and visit counts. So what can we learn from this research? The scent acts as a catalyst for focusing attention on goal-related outcomes, regardless of the sensory congruence. And using scent to manipulate attention may lead to intensified focus on the gambling outcomes. And the findings from this study suggest the need for casino operators to carefully consider the use of ambient scent. For example, casino games that are more popular among individuals experiencing impaired control over gambling behavior should be placed in areas without ambient scent. To sum up, this study highlights the powerful role scent played in directing attention during gambling and offering a new perspective on sensory marketing and its ethical implication for responsible gambling. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sunny. It is a really interesting study because I'm not aware of much research or any research actually. So perhaps you might know more about this, but I really like this because when we think about technology, we often think some sort of software or hardware, but it's also the technology of creating the experience. So inputs into our broader sense. So we now have, obviously this research on olfactory stimuli, and it's interesting because we know industry players are putting a lot of focus on how do you make the seat more comfortable or the haptics, the movement that people experience. And it's something that I don't think as gambling researchers have put as much attention to. So it's a really interesting area of study that you're doing. My first question is I'd like to know a little bit more around what your hypothesized mechanism of action is, because you're seeing that, the scent is leading to this eye tracking and attention, which we can see. But I'm aware also of research on, for example, moods that, shops often have user scents or color boards to influence people's moods. What do you think is the mechanism of action here in terms of, is it an emotional change? Is it a cognitive change? And was there any impact on behavioral change? Were people actually spending more money?
Okay, so first we choose to study the influence of scent. It's because the smell and the aroma stimulus has been well recognized for its influence on elicit emotion, as well as enhance the memory towards the experience. And we think that implement those scent in casino may enhance people's attention or their goal towards achieving like winning in gambling. And that's why we try to look at how this pleasant ambient scent can have more focus on their gambling outcome.
Okay, and what's next in terms of the remainder of your PhD and maybe your future research? What do you think this research will lead to?
So I think future study can potentially look at other different attributes because in this two studies we use the same scent in our experiment, but in the future study can look at different attributes like whether the scent is sweet or bitter, or is it more connected to nature or have other semantic association, and whether these kind of attributes affect its influence on people's attention. And also maybe incorporate other neural approach, a neuroscience approach, to see the neural connectivities that can tell us whether this change people's attention at a deep down.
And I'm also interested when you describe it as a pleasant scent. What was the scent that you used in this experiment? And is it possible that there is, I'm curious about the responsible gambling implications. Is your recommendation to have no scent, or is there a certain olfactory stimulation that could be positive in terms of responsible gambling, whether that means taking more breaks, or I'm not quite sure. I'm trying to figure out, what is the right recommendation for casinos. I can see the justification why casinos might want to use a pleasant scent. Certainly some casinos still have smoke. Some casinos are, venues can be dry, or like I can see that this is something that, there's a reason that venues would want to use a scent. If you just have lots of people there, it can just be a bit smelly. So is the recommendation no scent, or is there a specific scent or a range of senses where it tips into being unethical?
Okay, so based on the findings from this study, as compared to the no scent condition, well, obviously the pleasant scent do increase people's attention towards the gambling outcome. So we suggest we place those popular games among those maybe gamblers at risk into those areas without scent. But of course, we use the scent we use in the experiment. It's a compound scent, so with a mixture of different scents and ingredients. And in the future study, we might look at single ingredient scent. So to test if maybe some kind of scent would have like acceptable effect that can help the casino to provide a pleasant environment, at the same time, not induce more attention towards gambling outcome and causing problem or harm towards the gamblers.
Well, thank you so much, Sunny. Really interesting research. All right, so I'm now going to introduce the next speaker. So we've gone from Sydney, Macau. We're going to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Mana Azizsoltani from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where you are currently working on your PhD, I understand. Really happy to have you to join us today. Thank you so much. And I'd love to invite you to share your screen and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to share my screen in 1 second, but I know that my face will get smaller when I share my screen. So I'm a PhD student, PhD candidate now, I guess, at UNLV. I'm doing my dissertation in machine learning applications to hotel revenue management. I actually fell into gambling recently, and I've kind of become obsessed. My background is in mathematics and statistics, and so like the probability mixed with the AI applications and the new data and all that stuff really kind of, it caught my interest. And so I like to share let's see, here I could do this. I like to share some research that I've been doing. Can you see this? Yep, cool. I'd like to share some research that I've been doing on looking at session level data, big data set from Poland. Let's see if this is going to work. Here we go. So I'm kind of going to gloss over the beginning because I don't want to waste too much time. But basically the idea is, well, slot machines, they account for over 60% of the commercial gaming revenue in the US. And most studies using behavioral tracking data only use like online gambling studies or sports bettor studies, and they don't actually use land-based slot machines, which is kind of unfortunate because so many people play these land-based slot machines, and they account for so much of the revenue. And so the idea is that if we can use this new behavioral tracking data that's coming out, whether it's table games, whether it's slot machines, whether it's online gaming, can we identify harmful behaviors? And so the questions that I asked here for this study are, can we characterize slot machine players based on their behavior during their first 3 months of play? And then what do these profiles look like? And then the idea after that is, once we have these clusters formed, we'll take them and we'll add on life-to-date metrics, so like their whole lifetime of play, to look at how those clusters turn out over a long period of time based on their own 3 months of play. And so we took this big, huge Polish data set of like tons and tons of players, but we filtered it down to look at people who had at least 5 sessions in their first 3 months of play within a 5-year period. And so what we did is we had to like kind of engineer different sessions, and because obviously it's bet by bet data. So like every time someone clicks a slot machine, it records the data. And so in order to translate that into session information or player information, that needs to get summed up. And so there's a lot of data engineering that went into that. If anyone has any questions about how I did that, there's a lot of like subjectivity a little bit that goes into it. I try to be scientific about it. We use like different thresholds, but that's something I'd be happy to talk about in more depth. But in the interest of time, I will kind of gloss over that a little bit. And then for the clustering algorithm, we used 5 different variables that are typically used in problem gambling studies for markers of harm, one of them being the amount of money wagered, the frequency, the duration, and the trajectory of the gambling. And I kind of want to back up and like show how this data is collected. So we partner with this company called Axis, which is a data company where they basically put a black box onto a slot machine. You can see me there holding a black box. They plug that little black box into the back of the slot machine, and it takes the data from the machines and puts it onto the cloud. And then the cloud has transaction level data and bet level data. And so we didn't have the bet level data. We had the data that goes into the machine and out of the machine. And so we use that to engineer the sessions and like transaction level. And so I have them into two sections of the results. First, I wanted to show the clusters. We can see here very well the mass gaming is kind of teased out against the high rollers. So you can see here the three different groups of mass gaming where they have low average win-loss per session, and they have, you know, different variations of number of sessions per week, number of deposits per session, and the length they play. Interestingly enough, this cluster 3 right here, they were part of mass gaming, but they were the most quote unquote on paper sustainable group, where they had lower sessions per week. They didn't bet that many deposits per session, and then they also had a negative trajectory, meaning that their balance actually the number of money bet didn't increase. It actually decreased off. So they tapered off their bets. And that is could be found as a sustainable action, maybe not. And then you can kind of see here that I made this hyperplane here. This is a zero trajectory. So the ones that are up here are people that may burn out fast by increasing their bets a lot. Or on the bottom there, on the bottom underneath that plane, there's people that are they're tapering off their bets, and so they could be more sustainable. So what I did is I took these clusters and I actually tagged onto their lifetime data. And so I wanted to point out two kind of key things that I noticed. They have these patterns here of lifetime. So this is in years on the bottom, and so you can see here that you have the people that signed up newly, that have a little bit of a hump here, and then people that are, you know, that are your typical player. Most players lie in here, that they have a long lifetime. But when it comes to this one that I just mentioned, of the people that play a long time, possibly the most sustainable group, they actually don't have a very long lifespan. They actually have a short lifespan. Most of them do. So are they they look sustainable at the beginning? Are they really? We don't know. I have to keep looking through the data to understand why that is. Another thing that I noticed here is that there's significantly more women in group 4, which is one of the high roller groups, the one that bets less. And so because this is a Polish data set, there's obviously a huge skew towards men, but it was interesting because there's a significantly less amount of women in that group, whereas actually in the high roller group, they were all men. And so maybe it's the women accompanying them and betting the money. Maybe it's it could be for a variety of reasons. And then also the last thing here I wanted to just comment on is that while there were small significant differences between some of the means relative to the average numbers of sessions per week and also the win-loss between the first 3 months, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that, you know, there isn't that much of a difference between how someone will play in the first 3 months to how they'll play over their lifetime. And that there were small significant differences for a lot of the groups, but I think you could see here that the two distributions are very, very close. Here there's a significant difference, and here there's a significant difference. So we can see that most groups, especially on the mass gaming floor, these slot players are actually not really going to change their behavior once you look at them over those first 3 months. And that has implications for responsible gambling strategy, also for casino marketing strategy, because now you can profile these players and market specifically to them. And
Thanks.
so,
Manu, we'll have to finish off here.
perfect, I'm done. So
Excellent. You got your details there. Look, I think I'll have to replay that and listen and look at those graphs in a little bit more detail. So it's a good thing it's a webinar. Everyone can pause and go back. So there's so much more there to unpack. If you can just go to that previous slide. Did you look at how much people were spending? Or
yeah,
is it how long their sessions were?
their average win-loss is over
Okay,
here.
that's their win-loss. Okay, great. I think it was so it's the currency there that's throwing me off in terms of recognizing that. So, you know, what would you recommend in terms of the pattern that would be more sustainable for people to allow them to continue to play? What do you think is the ideal, I guess, that people should be encouraging to be able to keep a lifetime sustainable gambling without people spending more than affordable for them? Is it longer, slower sessions? You know, what's the recommendation from this?
So this is a question that is a very good question, by the way, because I have a very convoluted, not so convoluted, I guess, answer, but I have it in two parts. So I'm a consultant and I help casinos implement AI solutions, mostly on the marketing side. And so from that perspective, I'm looking from the casino perspective and trying to optimize um, revenue, right? And on the other side, I'm trying to pick players. And so kind of the answer to this question is, what is a sustainable pattern? Well, the markers of harm that people that are established in the literature, they're like, super high spend or very frequent trips and a lot of volatility. But a lot of times gamblers, they just have different profiles of play. So from my other lens, I look at it and say, look, well, someone might just come to the casino after work every day and they might have a beer and they might go home. Or someone might come on the weekend for all day long and they might use their comps and go eat lunch and then come back and play for a little bit and then go to the sports book and watch a game. And so just because someone like was there for 8 hours or 9 hours, that doesn't necessarily mean they are a harmful player. That might just be their style of play. Similarly, another one is like night play, right? So what if I go to the club and on my way out of the club, I say, oh, haha, I'm gonna throw, $25 on blackjack on the way out. And I throw $25 on blackjack. Does that make me a problem gambler because I had transactions at night, like on my way out of the club because I played at like 3 in the morning? I don't know. Is it? And so I think it's a hard question to ask. So from a problem gambling perspective, I would say yes, obviously, like people that are playing with very high variability, playing really hard with their bets, so they're betting lots and they're increasing their bets. Martingale type players, people that are playing with like mm, I guess like I don't want to say that, maybe like irrational type players. But
Okay.
also from a casino marketing perspective, right? Like these are just regular players sometimes. So it's really hard to teeter that line.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mana. And we'll have to cut it there, but I really appreciate your time.
Well, hello. In this next group, we're pleased to welcome Nolan Gooding of the University of Calgary, Callum Deery of University of Bristol, and Youssef Allami of Laval University. Thank you all for joining us. All right, Nolan, the floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Nolan Gooding. I'm a doctoral student in clinical psychology at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. And some of my recent work has been focused on validating a novel measure of gambling harm called the gambling harm measure. So the gambling harm measure is a novel 16-item instrument developed by Paul Del Fabro, Robert Williams, and Jonathan Park to improve upon existing instruments currently being used in the literature. And it does this in two primary ways. The first is that it comprehensively assesses the 6 principal domains of gambling harm, which are financial, psychological, relationship, physical health, work and study, and illegal acts. And the second way it improves upon existing instruments is that it explicitly aims to assess harm across a gradient of severity. And it does this by asking 3 dichotomously scored items within each domain. The first pertains to overprioritization of gambling, the second to pressures or strains due to gambling, and the third about serious consequences resulting from gambling. And this is true of all of the domains within the gambling harm measure, with the exception of illegal acts, which are presumed to be severely harmful in and of themselves. Another important feature of the gambling harm measure is that it attempts to enhance efficiency by dropping that serious consequences item within a given domain if people don't endorse pressures or strains, because we theoretically wouldn't expect people to endorse this more severe manifestation of harm if they don't endorse the more moderate one. So we conducted 2 separate studies, but the first one was geared towards understanding the factor structure and validity of the gambling harm measure. We used data from 3 independent surveys. The first was the baseline survey of an ongoing longitudinal study being conducted in Canada, which includes about 6,000 participants. And the second 2 were sourced from Massachusetts, one in 2022 and one in 2023, each of which include just under 2,000 participants. In this first study here, we found strong support for a unidimensional factor structure in the gambling harm measure, indicating that it's sort of tapping into this underlying single dimension of harm. And we found that this factor structure was invariant across the samples we used, as well as across different genders and different age groups. In terms of validity, we found that scores on the gambling harm measure correlate strongly with other measures of gambling harm, such as the PPGM harm subscale or the harm items of the PGSI, but that it correlates less strongly with other addictive disorders or mental health concerns. And we also found that the gambling harm measure or scores on the gambling harm measure increase as a function of gambling intensity in terms of the number of formats people are using, how often they're gambling, and how much money they're spending gambling. In our second study, we used the same data, but we wanted to explicitly test this idea that we're capturing a gradient of severity within different domains of harm in the gambling harm measure. And to do this, we used rash analysis. Rash analysis is an item response theory method that's suitable when we have unidimensional data, because ultimately what we're trying to do is estimate the probability that people endorse a given item based on their score on the instrument. We did, in fact, find support for this dimensionality piece. Within each domain, the overprioritization item was more easily endorsed than the pressures or strains item, which was more easily endorsed than the serious consequences item. And we also found that younger adults and those participating in electronic gambling machines, casino table games, and sports betting were more likely to endorse almost every item on this instrument, which is consistent with literature showing that these are risk factors for problem gambling. I want to thank my co-authors on this project, Youssef, Allami, who is the lead investigator on the Canadian data and has also helped me sort of conceptualize and troubleshoot this project. Paul Del Fabro, Robert Williams, and Jonathan Park for creating this instrument, but giving me the space to sort of run with it. Rachel Volberg for providing me with the Massachusetts data, and David Hodgins, who's my doctoral supervisor and has helped me conceptualize this project, as well as just supported me throughout my doctoral studies.
That's great. Thanks, Nolan. So a few questions immediately come to mind. And one is, it's really interesting to see the field progress from just thinking about harm conceptually to now thinking about it more empirically. My first question is, for those of us that have been used to thinking about gambling severity measures like the PGSI as outcome variables in a lot of our analysis, how should we think about now measures like this scale versus something like the PGSI, and where one would be appropriate over another?
Well, I think when we think of problem gambling, I was trained early on by Robert Williams, and he, in his like problem and pathological gambling measure, embraces like this sort of a two construct conceptualization of gambling, problem gambling, so harms as well as impaired control. And so when we use an instrument like the gambling harm measure, we're sort of honing in on that harm piece, which is also maybe from a public health perspective, the more prevalent piece that we'd want to be mitigating. So the constructs are like related, but they're sort of separate.
Yeah, so perhaps harm measures are more helpful in that sort of policy domain when you're tackling public health problems. But if you're looking more specifically at individual risks, something like the PGSI might be more well suited to those types of empirical questions.
I would think so, as well as, a little more clinically relevant, maybe. Harm, like you said, is on the policy side. We get a little more into a clinical space when we talk about problem gambling.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So what types of problems, this is something that looks like it's in the bag now. What are you working on right now, or what do you expect to be working on in the near future as far as your practice?
Yeah, so in terms of my dissertation research, we are, this was sort of step one to have a useful outcome measure that we could use to do some predictive modeling with gambling harm. So I'm hoping to utilize some more complex quantitative methods to understand some of the correlates and antecedents of gambling harm. Other than that, I am working with Dr. Youssef Allami on his ongoing project that's based around the pathways model of problem gambling. And so that's any work that sort of comes out of that, I'm also connected to.
Well, fantastic. Well, thanks very much for your presentation and coming on the TRG. Thanks, Nolan.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, Callum, the floor is yours.
Right. So are developers playing by the rules? Compliance with loot box advertising regulation in the UK and South Korea. This is research being undertaken by the team of Leon Zhao, Dr. Elena Petrovskaya, Solet Park, myself, Callum Deery, hello, Dr. Philip Newell, and Dr. David Zendel, based collectively out of the universities of York, Lincoln, and Bristol in the UK. And this is research comparing two regions where there is an expectation of disclosure of in-game monetization in adverts for the games which include it. The first of these regions is the UK, where it is requested by UKI, which is a self-regulatory industry body and enforced by stern tellings off by the Advertising Standards Authority. The second region is South Korea, where it is requirement by law for games to disclose the presence of in-game monetization in their adverts, and it is associated with potential fines and potential jail terms. So the goals of this research are to check, are companies complying with these, in one case self-regulation, in the other case laws? What do disclosures actually look like? And then also to allow us to make this comparison of how effective is industry self-regulation when it comes to matters of game monetization and disclosure. So we're doing this by looking at ads placed on Meta, Facebook's ad library. We started with an initial list of 390 games, which previous research has identified as containing loot boxes as a form of monetization. We find each game's page within the ad library. We gather a sample of 10 ads, and we check for the presence of disclosures. If you're wondering what a disclosure might look like, there's one on this slide somewhere. And if you're viewing on mobile, that's the real size it is in the game ad. And then we've got some early results from going through the list for the UK. Of the initial list of 390 games, 69 games that are advertised on Meta's ad library post-guidance. This totaled to 618 ads, with 84 including disclosures. So about 14% of the adverts across a total of 13 games. So 13 out of 69 games just actually included some kind of disclosure, which is about 18%. The other sort of findings that we have that are broadly applicable beyond games is that Meta's ad library presents several hurdles for effective data gathering, particularly around its aggressive anti-bot detection. Even though we're not using bots and are looking through this as researchers, this gets repeatedly triggered and causes various problems, such as hiding results from us. And so that's the research, and that's the results so far.
Well, thank you for that presentation. It's really interesting. I mean, what comes to mind immediately is, this is the reason why in the sort of conventional gambling industry, there's regulators that have compliance functions and do actual audits, because it seems like that it's certainly an issue. Is that what you think needs to happen here, or where does this sort of lead you to think about policy directions?
Yeah, so this is part of the point of the comparison here, right? So South Korea does treat in-game monetization much more similarly to having like a proper regulator and such. And companies are fairly regularly fined over incorrect odds disclosures or unexpected changes to odds, the sort of things that you see with gambling regulators. One of the big problems that is kind of in the future is that game companies are very international. And for many of the people who aren't complying with, say, Yuki's requests, it's pretty likely that they don't even know what Yuki is, never mind that it has these guidelines that they're supposed to follow. And there's lots of barriers to potential regulation actually being effective, even if developers are aware of it and are in good faith complying with it. Yeah.
Do you see like an obvious path forward there, or something that stands out as something that can be done to sort of improve outcomes?
An obvious path forward would be an application of a bare minimum disclosure standard. This has been sort of effective in changes to game age ratings through PEGI and the ESRB, which have recently made some changes to ratings to include essentially monetization, including gambling elements category. And one of the most effective parts of the South Korean law is that it mandates a specific phrase for the disclosures, whereas under the Yuki guidance, it's sort of however you would like to disclose.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, a bare minimum standard for developers to start complying with, basically.
So is this a field of research that you I see obviously you're still working on this. Is this what you're focusing on right now, and what do you hope to be focusing on in the future in your research career?
Yeah, so I definitely like to continue focusing on this, and potentially also further looking into other platforms, and because lots of platforms have to have some kind of ad library due to EU legislation surrounding political ads. That's why these ad libraries exist. And so TikTok has one, YouTube has one, and YouTube is tied into the wider Google one. So there is potentially quite large data sets for investigating how game adverts are working. And there's various other sort of, I'm going to use the phrase mild controversies to do with game advertising that it would be good to document and research.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Callum.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Youssef, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. My name is Youssef Allami. I'm a newly appointed assistant professor at Laval University in Quebec, Canada, the French-speaking part of Canada. And happy to be here today after completing a few years of postdoc out west in Calgary. And so I'm here to talk about a project that I've been working on for a while now that is actually built on my dissertation work. Some of you must have heard about the pathways model, which basically talks about 3 different types of pathways leading to eventually developing problem or pathological gambling. And without jumping too much into the details of what every pathway is or describes, just keep in mind that there are 3 groups. One tends to be less problematic than the other 2. So the behaviorally conditioned group tends to be less problematic. Emotionally vulnerable people tend to have underlying anxiety or depression, and they tend to gamble to cope with those feelings. And a more biologically vulnerable group that tends to be more impulsive and maybe have certain antisocial behavior. So keep that in mind. And then there's this other element that we've been finding in the literature. A few colleagues out in Calgary, such as David Hodgins, have been doing a lot of work on that. And it's based on the notion that, well, for some reason, around half of the people with gambling problems tend to naturally recover without ever seeking help. So without ever seeking formal treatment, going to see a psychologist, group therapy, or whatever. So the idea here is, well, first of all, who are the people that naturally recover? And who are those that, yeah, for some reason, it's tougher for them there? Add on to that, another concept that we're trying to understand better, the one of addiction substitution. So it's this notion that suppose I have a gambling problem, and then, well, with time, I diminish my gambling behavior. Well, for some people, there tends to be this switch to other forms of addictive behavior, such as alcohol use or even binge eating to a certain extent. So we're trying to figure out how to take all these 3 concepts together, these 3 theories together, and to better understand who naturally recovers, who substitutes addictions, and while keeping in mind a notion of the pathways model. So we've been collecting data for the past year. We still have 1 more year of data collection left. So it's basically a 2-year longitudinal study, 4 waves. And we will be seeing basically who naturally recovers, who substitutes addiction. And what we expect to see, well, is basically that people in the behaviorally conditioned group, whenever they remit from their gambling problems, well, whether they get treatment or not, we're not expecting to see any substitution. However, for the other two groups, emotionally vulnerable and biologically vulnerable, well, if they get formal treatment, we would expect them to not substitute addictions because we would assume that actually the underlying elements that may account for developing an addiction to any type of addictive behavior will be taken care of. However, if we observe a decrease in gambling behavior in these two groups, but they do not seek treatment, that would be a situation where we would actually witness addiction substitution. And so it's an interesting study. I find it particularly interesting, and I would be so excited to, I mean, I am so excited to eventually share these results with you. So just to also show some support and acknowledgement for this whole team of people that have actually allowed me to be where I am today, not only in terms of research mentorship, in terms of clinical mentorship, because I'm also an addiction clinical psychologist, and in terms of professional career mentorship. I just want to highlight that you don't get to where you are by yourself, and that it's important to know that there's a whole team behind. Thank you for listening to me.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. That is such a well-articulated model and well-defined hypothesis. It's really interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing your eventual results. I know you have a deep clinical background. How much of that influenced some of your ideas here, and are you sort of leaning on that experience in how you define these hypotheses?
Absolutely. So first of all, the notion of addiction substitution was first inspired by people that I have seen in an addiction center where I worked for 5 years before getting into a postdoc. But there's also another research project that I'm working on that was 100% inspired by my clinical work, and it's related to attachment styles and addictive behaviors. So I've had some patients talk to me about the way they feel connected, attached to whether it is gambling or their bottle of wine. And there's like this relaxing, calming moment that they have one-on-one in a bath with their glass of wine. And that's a sort of appeasing moment that people tend to attribute to the substance or the behavior, but that tends to be triggered by attachment and relational issues. So that also informed another project that I'm currently working on. So yep, definitely back and forth between the two.
Very interesting. And so in your new role, are those sort of the two work streams that you plan to be working on over the next 5 years?
So there are those work streams, but there's also another related element. So in Canada, the way our gambling policy functions, so you basically have a federal level, but then every province is able to choose how they provide gambling services, gambling products to the population. So in Quebec, for example, it's a state monopoly. In province of Ontario, there's a open licensing system where, sure, there's a state-owned company, but there's also more than 80 different private companies that are allowed to operate there. So another element that I am getting into is comparing these different provincial models and trying to identify the impact, not only the socioeconomic impact, but also in terms of preventing relapse and, for example, people who are trying to recover from a gambling disorder but get constantly triggered by 15 company ads while they're watching a hockey game. So trying to see how certain policy regulations could affect gambling harm.
Oh, interesting. So a very different macro view than this other work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Youssef.
Thank you very much for your time.
So that brings a wrap on our ECR showcase and the end of season 5, which has gone past really quickly. If you're enjoying the Technology Risk Gambling Seminar Series and you would like to see a season 6, please share these episodes. The more views we have, the more we can see that this is making a contribution. If you'd like to send a comment or send any feedback, if you'd like to see anyone featured, if you have any recommendations for topics or speakers, please reach out, please say hi, let me know. If there is enough interest in this seminar series, it'd be a pleasure to come back for a 6th season, but we really need to know, what are you interested in? So thank you to all of our early career researchers. Thank you to everyone who was on this season, and a big, big, big thank you to TJ Santos and Harrison Stein for providing the amazing background from the Brain and Mind Centre supporting this webinar series. So until next time, bye now.